All right, let's kick off. So, look, welcome everyone to this Snack and Learn webinar. And we're going to cover off on a whole lot of things. We'll go into that in a minute, but on TCFD reporting and real world action. I'll introduce myself. Matt, do you want to flick through that slide? Great. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Belmont, te maunga, ko Kairangi te awa, no te awa Kairangi ahau engare, no Melbourne, tuku kainga ana, ko Dean, tuku whanau, ko Hunter, tuku inwa, ka nui te mihi, kia koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Hunter, and in our Māori culture here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have something called a mihi when we introduce ourselves. I just covered off on the fact that my mountain is Mount Belmont. I come from the Hutt Valley in Lower Hutt, but I actually have spent the last 24 odd years in Australia. Have been back just over a year, and welcome to everyone. Look, I head up the assets pillar of our strategic advisory team, and I'm here today to moderate the session. Before I hand over to Matt to introduce himself, we've actually had Azura call in sick late last night, so it's really unfortunate we won't have her on the call, but Matt will cover off on those pieces. So hand over to Matt now.
Thanks, Hunter. Tēnā koutou, ko Matt Rayburn tōku ingoa. Greetings, my name is Matt Rayburn. I'm an American Kiwi working as WSP's Asia Pacific Climate Scenarios and Disclosures Lead from Whanganui Aotearoa, also known as Wellington, New Zealand. I'm from New York, but spent the first half of my career as an environmental lawyer in Washington, D.C. I've been with WSP for the last 2 years. I've been a consultant supporting clients with their climate strategies and reporting since 2016. And I spent a few years with the Ministry for the Environment in New Zealand on its climate change adaptation and sustainable finance teams when New Zealand became the first country to adopt mandatory climate-related disclosures across most of our financial system and economy. We're 2 years into that mandatory climate disclosure regime in New Zealand, which is valuable as a strategic exercise, even independent of its stated aim, which is to transparently disclose to investors, lenders, insurers, and other stakeholders the largely under-recognized risks and opportunities related to climate change. And in New Zealand, we're already starting to see the progression from a strategic response to climate change to a more technical and entity-wide implementing work program. That implementing work program requires engineering, scientific, planning, and other technical expertise, in addition to advisory and financial expertise. And I'll segue back to Hunter to speak to where WSP and advisors like the deep bench of specialists we have access to globally can help with that. Hunter.
Thanks, Matt. Great. So look, a little bit about us. Matt's mentioned a few things there. Global experience, enormous around climate change, transition planning, and those technical specialists that Matt mentioned in our engineering sectors are absolutely key to much of the work we're doing in this space. We've got some things there around property and buildings, earth and environment, transport and infrastructure, power and energy, investments and financial modelling, multi-advisory and strategic advisory. All of those areas are absolutely crucial in this work, and you can see some of our team up there also. Look, there's some labels on there in terms of organisations. We're working with a lot of different large businesses here in New Zealand, but also in Australia and beyond. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those as we kind of go through this morning. Thanks, Matt. Great. So look, today we're going to cover off on a whole lot of different areas, specifically insights into recent climate disclosures and their implications, the importance of governance and climate reporting and disclosure practices, some strategies in terms of enhancing the quality and impact of your climate reporting requirements and expectations for climate disclosure in 2025. Also some practical steps to improve your climate disclosure practices and aligning New Zealand's climate disclosure standards with those of Australia. Just before I do hand back to Matt, I just want to say, if you can save your questions to the end, please ask them in that dialogue box. The PDF for this preso will be sent out, and so that will happen after as well. All right, great, thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Hunter. So I'm just going to set the scene to start out with, and I want to talk about transparency and why it relates to transition planning. There's a notion that I'm really drawn to, this idea of rigorous honesty, and it's searching and fearless type of honesty. It's backed by good intentions. And the notion of an honest self-assessment is applicable to the commercial and government contexts. But where rigorous honesty is most important is for oneself or for the business or other organization that you're a part of. And without that rigorous honesty and self-assessment, an organization cannot make useful decisions about how to act or how to influence. Rest assured, and this is especially for the accountants and fellow lawyers in the audience, that doesn't mean sharing everything that can be shared. And for those who haven't performed the full climate disclosure process before, the disclosures probably involve sharing less than what you might fear. So even when practicing this kind of rigorous honesty, it's vital to exercise discretion, and that's true whether you're talking about commercially sensitive information or sensitive information from government entities. And so that's why we perform climate-related disclosures. What does this have to do with climate change transition planning? Well, the risks, opportunities, and financial impacts related to climate change are happening and will continue to happen to us, whether we want them to or not. Even if all greenhouse gas emissions were to cease tomorrow, further global warming would be baked in beyond 2030, and nonlinear increases in extreme weather are also effectively a certainty at this point. So you can't increase revenue without adapting to changes that will disrupt. We're not going to talk about climate scenarios much today, save for saying that there's really no plausible future where climate change is not disruptive to what we think of as BAU for the global economy. And we're not just talking about the physical impacts of climate change, which could be anything from much worse than today's to a full hothouse scenario. We're talking about the transition impacts of climate change. Even though the US has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, it's still been ratified by over 190 countries in the EU. I don't know whether it'll be successful in limiting global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, but with that kind of momentum, some significant amount of decarbonization globally, even if it's not enough, will occur. And that's not even accounting for the tech sector and institutional investors, other financial institutions, which have largely already decided that this transition will happen and are acting accordingly. So to disregard this or to indulge in wishful thinking is to assume a financial risk that could be material to your organization. And to help drive that point home in a way that's maybe a bit more emotionally impactful before we move on, I'm just going to share a quote from the novelist Cormac McCarthy, which I like. In the end, we all come to be cured of our sentiments. Those whom life does not cure, death will. The world is quite ruthless in selecting between the dream and reality, even where we will not. Between the wish and the thing, the world lies waiting. During the fires in Los Angeles in January, I was thinking about some of my family and friends there, but I also thought about one of my climate disclosure clients in New Zealand, Tourism Holdings. Tourism Holdings has hundreds of thousands of customers every year that rent its RVs, which it also sells and designs and builds. They have not yet issued their transition planning disclosures, but they have identified a climate-related revenue generating opportunity that I think really highlights the upside of the transition planning process. So they identified the increased demand for mobile housing and emergency vehicles as an opportunity across all 6 of their operating regions, all 3 climate scenarios, including a rapid decarbonization and hothouse scenario, and all 3 of the time horizons that they looked at for last year's disclosures. And they know that this is a real opportunity because of their experience. Their RVs have been used for mobile housing or service delivery and related to flooding and cyclone hurricane events, which has recently included 4,500 hire days for flood response and people displaced by Cyclone Gabrielle in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and 7,300 hire days for flood responses in Australia. So it's really about also identifying and pursuing those revenue generating opportunities, as well as managing the financial risks that come from climate change. So about transition planning, well, it's not a standalone process. It should build on prior work and integrate with overall strategy and make it part of a consistent and long-term repositioning and transformation strategy. And to be clear, climate change strategy and business strategy should be inseparable. And that is something that this transition planning process aims to make happen. A lot of people are concerned about it being something that is going to change year on year. Well, that's true of a lot of strategy and a lot of things that come out of public disclosures, but it's supposed to be an iterative and dynamic process that should be frequently reviewed, updated, improved on year. And the reason we say the transition planning instead of a transition plan, active verb, because we are not developing a certain and finished plan. It's constantly being revised. And our additional contribution at WSP is this idea of the transition work program, which is how you implement transition planning. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. So in New Zealand, and this is generally true of all of the jurisdictions where climate disclosures are required or where there's a prescribed regime, but our external reporting board in New Zealand has a clear process, and we start with global and economy sector-wide climate scenarios. We use those to develop scenarios that are tailored to a specific entity. And the results of that scenario analysis are not so much about the written outputs, but it's rather an increased understanding of a need for transformation and the fundamental lack of resilience that a lot of business models and strategies will have to the diverse range of climate outcomes. And again, some of this is going to happen no matter what, and it will happen to you. So it's about how you respond to it. But as our external reporting board has said, if the implications are not indicative of a lack of resilience and need for transformation from that scenario analysis exercise, then you probably have not met the criteria of using plausible, challenging, and coherent scenarios. So you use those scenarios to identify climate-related business and financial impacts to your organizations. You only need to disclose those that are material, but the transition plan process that follows is how you respond to them strategically. And the transition work program, which we'll get to in more detail, is how you implement that response.
Matt, that's great. I'm interested, although the focus areas started out very much from a compliance.
The aim of the Aotearoa climate standards, and we're one of many countries that have now adopted this, and very proud that we were the first to pass legislation on it, but it's to support allocation of capital towards the activities that are consistent with a transition to a low emissions and more climate resilient future. And that's essentially the aim of the process as a whole. This all started with the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures framework almost 10 years ago now. And actually Mark Carney, who's one of the godfathers of that framework, and probably the other biggest face of it besides billionaire Michael Bloomberg, just became the Prime Minister of Canada, replacing Justin Trudeau. So, and he, based on the last poll that I saw, has a good shot at winning a majority for his Liberal Party during the Canadian election next month. So despite the kind of recent news reporting about an ESG backlash in the States in particular, there's still a lot of support in a lot of these countries for that kind of reporting. And our XRB in New Zealand, which has set the standards here, has been leading the way. Australia, very fortunately, is now catching up to where we are in New Zealand. Their standards have gone into effect from the Australian Accounting Standards Board at the beginning of this year. And they largely align with the international IFRS standards, which are broadly trying to line up a lot of the standards on climate reporting, including transition planning across the world. New Zealand was first out of the gate, so our standards differ in some meaningful ways, but not in ways that should be prohibitive in terms of aligning with global reporting. But it's worth noting that, yes, the US is no longer in the gold on that map. They are basically, as a regulatory mechanism, canning the proposed rule for disclosures from the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Matt, can you hear me?
Our team recently gave some pre-release feedback on New Zealand's climate transition planning implementing guidance for staff, which was published this month. Staff guidance is for those leading or coordinating transition planning within their businesses or organization, and it's really important and essential reading for sustainability and strategy leads, and completes a suite of transition planning guidance for executives, directors, some of which we've also reviewed and given some pre-release feedback. But I want to pull out, I think, a very good explanation of this from the XRB. A transition plan truly embedded in an organization's day-to-day operations results in KPIs, monitoring, accountability lines, and other processes aligned with the long-term strategic intent. The execution should be supported by appropriate adjustments in structure, processes, capability, and leadership to elicit an organizational culture aligned with the strategy. Some call it a transition work program.
Matt, can you hear me?
And so, as I've said, it's not just governments that want this, it's the financial system. And we've demonstrated that with a recent report that WSP sponsored and was written by my colleague here, Callie Mercer, called Premiums Under Pressure: How Climate Change is Reshaping Residential Property Insurance and What to Do About It. And some of the conclusions of that report: without effective policy measures, insurance premiums may become unaffordable, leading households to reduce or cancel cover. Over time, insurers will withdraw coverage in high areas like floods and coastal erosions, making it infeasible to sell insurance there. And insurance retreats, which Belinda Story coined here in New Zealand as a term, is already very common in places overseas and has been badly hit by climate-related events in recent years. You probably heard a lot about that during the Los Angeles fires. So again, this is not just about a regulatory requirement or a compliance requirement. This is something that the financial system, tech sector, they've decided that this is happening, and so it will happen because it is a financial risk and a financial revenue generating opportunity for them if they can unlock the right opportunities. In terms of how that process is actually performed, this is just an example, a very, very simplified example of a framework we take clients through to identify how they're already managing their climate risks and opportunities in tangible ways to manage them going forward. It's really the fun and interesting part of this disclosure process. People really get into it because it's actually addressing the issues that you need to address through strategy and then through implementation. And we're trying to really, hammer home that this is the logical outcome of that scenario development, risk assessment, opportunity assessment, materiality rating process is this transition planning process to actually be able to address the transition and physical impacts from climate change. And the way to actually implement it is via a transition work program. So, you start at this strategy level where you have your business strategy integrated with your climate change strategy or the climate change aspects of your strategy, and that's what transition planning is. And you do all of the work on your risk assessments and your opportunity assessments using organizational information. It could be asset information, could be climate-related information, to develop scenarios, use those scenarios in scenario analysis, and to test the resilience of your current business model and strategy in the same way COVID has tested the resilience of companies' business models and strategies, in the same way the global financial crisis, in the same way that the current recession here in New Zealand has tested the resilience of your strategy, the way that AI, other megatrends may test your strategy. And the way to implement that is that it's got to have this implementing transition work program underneath. There's various ways you can do it, but it really is a change process, one that has work streams with assigned roles and responsibilities. You can align it with dynamic adaptive policy pathways, which is an approach kind of uses metro maps about how you monitor signals, reach trigger points, and make decisions from there. But that transition work program is the key to all of this. That's how you actually make it real. All right, Hunter, I think you're up.
Can you hear me, Matt? I don't think Matt, sorry to the audience, I don't think Matt can actually hear me right now, but can you hear me, Matt? Right, I'm just going to get a roll. I was going to ask Matt a few questions here, but I'm just going to take this slide while he works out how things are going. So look, I think there's a few things here. The challenges, how can your organization better meet climate disclosure obligations? How can business units understand their roles and responsibilities inside that transition plan? And we'll describe that in a minute slightly more. Can you hear me now, Matt?
Yes, I can. And sorry if you've been talking over me in the last
Yeah,
10
no, it's
minutes.
all good. You actually could not hear us. So look, I've just finished that piece around challenges and what, as an organization, more could you do to integrate climate related and enterprise risks? Matt, I am going to ask you a question then. When you first started doing this work, what was the key focus and who were you working with, and what were your clients' core objectives at that point, and how has this kind of changed?
Yeah, I mean, this started out with most clients wanting to know what is the minimum that we have to do to comply. And I'm a former lawyer, so I get where they're coming from on that. But it's really become, I think it's been great to see sort of these light bulb moments as execs and directors actually start to see the value in this process, because this is not something that they get an opportunity to do a lot of in other non-climate related contexts either, to really evaluate their strategy, see what's working, and to test the resilience of it to see what can change. And sure enough, if you're making your strategy more resilient to climate change, you're going to make it more resilient to a lot of other impacts as well. So yeah, seeing companies really start to appreciate the value in this has been great. I'm also just going to take my headset off, Hunter, because I think that it keeps muting out for some reason. So sorry for the echo on my mic when I take this off.
Can you hear us now, Matt?
Yeah, I can.
All right, that's fine. Great. So do you want to just cover off on the rest of that slide, and then I'll jump on the next one?
Yeah, so just to talk a bit about some of the implications from this process, or I'm sorry, from the challenge of climate change. There's the risk to the resilience of your organization's products and services. You may not be able to maintain growth of products and services, reduce costs, and the financial performance can suffer absent a transition work program. And the big idea here is to actually integrate transition planning into your business strategy, with resilience to climate-related impacts being core to it, and by a practical and implementing transition work program, enabling your business units to realize the transition plan. An integrated climate transition plan, corporate risk framework, and risk management process are how you actually get to that resilience.
Great. Look, I'll just say a couple of things here in terms of the work that we're doing. That inner circle TCFD framework and requirements leading to that transition plan, as we've been talking about. And if you go one circle across the left, you see kind of an organization's BAU. Every organization has a strategy and a whole lot of business operations, and most every business has an operational excellence or continuous improvement program and ways that they're innovating. This piece right in the middle of resilience is about, the products and services that are out there in the market right now. In most cases, organizations are asking, how do we make more revenue? How do we reduce our costs? And this is absolutely key to kind of moving forward. The technical kind of engineering, deep expertise that WSP brings sit in these sectors, as we've mentioned, which is a large part of the work that we are doing in terms of bringing that expertise. There are two other areas just to cover off on there. On the far right is this almost disruption or disruptor curve, and whether that's AI and how it's changing our business. Our organization has a concept called Future Ready, which covers off on a whole lot of the biggest mega trends happening in the market. And these are things, many of which Matt has mentioned already, whether it's IoT, Internet of Things, smart cities, etc. We are being forced to change at a huge rate of knots, and therefore this work is not just about complying. It's about how do we ensure that we can continue improving our revenue and reducing costs. And then on the far left, that circle around funding and financing investors is also absolutely crucial. The large financial institutions, and Matt's spoken a bit about insurance, are looking very carefully at what their largest clients are doing in this whole space as well. So I think it's absolutely critical, and that's kind of just a little bit on how it kind of fits together. Thanks, Matt. We also have a concept. I, as mentioned, spent a lot of time in Australia and did a whole lot of work in that inside of the level crossing program. And if you think about the mobile phone, every day we're pulling data down from the sky all day, and we're also pushing it up. And I did a project in there which was using technology to do exactly that. And when I started looking at the work we're doing here, it's very similar. So in the first, second, third year, effectively we're creating a mechanism to pull data from across the business and assess what's happening in order to comply and put it into the reporting. And what I realized is that effectively what we don't want is to be going out there every year repeating this process of pulling things together and putting a huge amount of effort in. So it just made real sense to me that if we can set up a system that enables all of that to happen just as a way of doing business, then the business doesn't need to worry so much about huge costs every year. It actually becomes a part of how we do things. So that's been a big part of our focus as well. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Hunter. And I do know that there's questions appearing in the chat, so I'll try to get through the rest of these case studies pretty quickly. But I do want to highlight some work that we've done for Wellington International Airport for their first transition plan. I mean, there's only so much that an airport can do to help airlines to decarbonize. That is where most of the scope 3 in particular emissions come from an airport. One of the things that they identified that they're going to actually they are putting capital deployments towards is the diversification and interests, diversification of interests, that should be, of the airports. So they're exploring diversifying their business to reduce financial impacts from climate change. They're developing their commercial businesses, such as retail. They have a solar energy trial. They're exploring renewable energy, carbon offsetting opportunities, staying very close to blue carbon, looking at kelp, looking at other carbon farming opportunities. So the transition planning process is not about you saying, here's how we're going to solve climate change for our business. It's just about being able to identify what you can do and what resources you need to put forward in order to do that. Along a similar line, again, ArborGen Holdings, like Tourism Holdings, has not yet released their transition plan, but they did identify in the report that we supported them with last year an increased demand for advanced genetic seedlings because they're a forestry seedlings developer, and they wanted to make sure that they had a focus on developing seedlings that have a greater resistance to disease, to weather, to pests, all of which become more difficult as a result of climate change. And that doesn't necessarily just mean that they have to put a lot of capital into that. They have the ability to diversify their product base, to potentially partner with other organizations in R&D, and for enhanced carbon sequestration as well, to be part of the solution to climate change, especially for areas where decarbonization is technologically not yet quite feasible. Lastly, as an example, I just want to point out that it's not just about what is within your direct control. It's really identifying the levers of influence that you have. So this is from ITV in the UK and was shared by my Washington, D.C. based WSP colleague Dana Davis as a good example to look at. But this full transition plan that ITV has released, they are, by the way, the purveyors of Love Island, for those who know. They identified levers in which they can use their influence to affect the decarbonization of other organizations within their value chain, because other organizations, decarbonizations that they deal with as part of their value chain can ultimately affect them as part of their scope 3s. And I've identified each of these levers for each of the categories under the greenhouse gas emissions protocols, and also where they're at and being able to exercise that influence. So it's about what's directly within your control, sure, but it's also about what you're able to influence. And this is particularly true, I think, of banks and insurers. They're going to need to help their customers to decarbonize in order to help them decarbonize. And so again, we've touched on what WSP does here. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to hire us or a firm like us to be able to do this process, but you need to have that kind of capability either internally or externally in order to be able to do this and to make it real. So in terms of what to take away, well, build on the work that you're already doing, but remember that this is about financial risk. The disclosures are going to be relatively easy. Transition planning is going to be harder, but that's where the value actually is in this process. But fortunately, it is iterative and should be building on the good work that you're already doing. Your climate strategy should be your business strategy, and business strategy should include your climate strategy. It should not be a separate and disparate parts. And the transition work program is how you can actually make it real. For those who want to make it real, I'm not here to convince you that this is something you should do, nor is this process about convincing you that you need to act dramatically or against your own commercial interests on climate change. All it's saying is that you have an option to become more rigorously honest with yourself, because that transition planning prepares you to respond to and be more resilient to a global economy that will be disrupted by decarbonization and the physical impacts of climate change. Happy to take questions.
Matt, we have one question we have is, can we clarify what we mean by information gathering pull structure under the transition work program implementation? I think I'll take that one. So effectively what we mean is, if you think about a function like finance or risk, either we are pulling information in from the business or we're pushing it out to the business. So in this context, it might be, we did the reporting last year, and as a part of our process this year, we're going to push a survey out in order to check in on kind of status across the business units of key climate risks. And as a part of that, there might be a pull process, which is, there's an expectation, because we set up the process, that business units will be pushing their information back so that we don't actually need to do too much. It all just comes in by itself. Matt, did you want to add anything to that?
I think you summed it up very well. I mean, the benefit of doing that is that you're not scrambling to meet reporting deadlines in terms of gathering your information, which is generally how it's done. And I understand that. Look, I know that this kind of functionality at a lot of organizations is very thinly resourced, but if you can put the upfront investment in time in order to set up some of these structures, and this goes for all the aspects of transition planning and the transition work program, you will see benefits from it. It's the same kind of thing that you would do for any other kind of investment to improve the longer term of your business. And so that might involve some CapEx upfront, but if that reduces your OpEx going forward, then that's a good thing, and that's something that you can include as part of the context when you share it with investors.
Great, Matt. There's another question there. Are there some climate risks that have been coming up that you may not have expected, and or ones that come up more than you expect?
That's a good one. Ones that I wouldn't have expected so much. I mean, I think a lot of some of them that a lot of clients we work with maybe aren't expecting is the kind of disruption to the value chain and how that affects their business directly. And at this point, every executive has some experience with that, because COVID was obviously like a huge economic disruptor. So they see that is something that can happen, but starting to see that a cyclone or hurricane, as we call them in the northern hemisphere, could hit the port of Houston and could affect global oil prices as a result of that, oil and gas prices, because of the refining that happens there. Those are the kinds of things that then filter down into this very geographically isolated and relatively very small economy that we have here in New Zealand. We are very vulnerable due to our isolation, which has always been true from an economic standpoint, but is even going to be tested and revealed even more under any climate scenario that unfolds. If there is a push towards broader decarbonization, and there's a push towards even things that are already available technologically, like electric vehicles, New Zealand might not be the first country to be in line for access to the limited supply. There's still a constrained supply of not just vehicles, but batteries. So these are the kinds of things that I think some organizations maybe hadn't really thought about enough until getting to this. So yeah, that's maybe a more common risk that's come up. Set of risks.
That's great. Look, I think personally for me, having lived the last 23, 24 years in Australia, some of the events, weather events specifically, but also fires that are happening over summer were just unbelievable how quickly they grew and how massive that was, and the impact that's having on many organizations in Oz. And like Matt's saying, very less likely that it's going to stop. So it's a really hard one. Matt, there's another question here. How getting the building certificates like Green Star, Home Star, neighbours can help the climate disclosures? Can that help? And is there any preference over these building certificates for the purpose of climate disclosure, or in terms of mitigating strategies? Yeah.
No preference, I wouldn't say. I mean, it tends to be, in New Zealand, Green Star and tends to be used a lot with our commercial clients. So that one comes up a lot, but it's part of the story that you tell. It's like Wellington Airport, with being able to identify what is within their control to influence, and what is within their direct control. I mean, Wellington Airport is doing a lot of work to reduce their own operational emissions and their electricity use. I mean, here our electricity is overwhelmingly from renewable sources in New Zealand, so low emissions from their electricity use, but they can make further efforts to further electrify. And similarly, like the Green Star certification and having those kinds of assets that are certified in that way and that are more energy efficient and are going to help with decarbonization and hopefully be more resilient to the physical impacts of climate change as well. That's part of the story that you tell, and that's something that you can do. It's not by itself going to be enough to successfully transition. A Green Star certification requires a lot of CapEx and investments. It's not something that you necessarily have to do either as part of your transition, because there's a lot of things that are open in terms of options for assets, which can include things like divestment, can include retrofitting, those kinds of things. But there's certainly something useful to being able to say, as our client MetLife Care has been able to point to some of the Green Star builds that they've done recently for their retirement villages. Like that's a great thing to be able to do. That's, if you're not sure what else to do within your direct control, within your construction and property, then that's something that you should be focusing on. But no preference for a particular type for climate disclosures, I wouldn't say.
Matt, there's another question. How did the New Zealand recession impact companies' appetite for transition plan work? I'll start the answer, but I'd like you to share as well. I think the major focus by our team in doing this work on business improvement and performance improvement of the organization summed up as resilience. Like, how can we be more resilient to climate risks? How will this affect us? Is a huge focus on the work we're doing, and therefore I think is seen as high value. And it may not be when we just get out of the gate, but very quickly working with the senior execs and board level, it's been taken extremely seriously. Matt, anything else to say on that?
There's been more of a focus because of the recession probably on the physical impacts of climate change and responding to that through transition planning, more of a focus on insurance retreat, which we touched on before. So that's been kind of the shift. There's been less of probably an emphasis on decarbonization and putting CapEx towards decarbonization. But that being said, there still is a real focus for being prepared to decarbonize. And that's should be the approach, I would say, generally for a small country, a small economy like New Zealand. It's about being prepared for what is going to happen. Again, this is going to happen to you. Some amount of decarbonization is going to happen. Not all 190 countries are going to abandon the Paris Agreement and tear it up. So you need to be prepared as that transformation starts to occur if you want to be able to take advantage of the opportunities for generating revenue and to manage your risks from climate change. And so, for questions like for clients like Tourism Holdings, it's a question of, how quickly are they going to be able to transition their fleet of RVs to electric or hydrogen or whatever technology. As they say, they're technology agnostic, but being able to respond quickly. So I think it's helped to focus a lot of organizations on what I think is really the best approach, which is about being prepared to respond, because there is so much out of your control. But then you can focus on what is directly within your control and what you have the ability to influence, like those Scope 3 emissions reduction levers that ITB identified. And for the sake of Love Island, I hope that they're successful.
Yeah, great. There's another question. Have you seen board level sensitivity on the disclosure of transition plan aspects, and how was this navigated? Look, I'll start that one by saying, there were some logos up there of clients of ours. There are a lot of major organizations that are not up there. And so I think it is, extremely sensitive, and many of our clients, we will work with them in different ways in terms of what we can or can't disclose. Matt, any other thoughts on that from a board kind of level?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest issue in New Zealand is that directors are personally liable for potential issues with the climate disclosures, and so there has been some risk aversion to that. But it really is just about being transparent and being able to tell a cohesive story and being able to include the right context. And in my experience working with directors of boards, they tend to be less risk averse than probably people in maybe at the executive level, or certainly in more of the kind of middle management level. So I think they are willing to actually tell their story. And this is not, again, about trying to get you to spend unreasonable amounts of CapEx to decarbonizing when it's not in your commercial interests to do that. But it is about being transparent about what you can control, what you can't, and what you plan to do about that in terms of putting resources towards it. And that's no different than other financial disclosures should be. So, I was really heartened when the Institute of Directors here in New Zealand had their first kind of climate reporting event. And it was largely attended by experienced directors. There were very few other consultants like me in that room. It was a lot of people who had been on boards for years, decades, and were really interested in learning how they could do this better. And whether or not the personal liability survives some potential proposed legislative changes in New Zealand remains to be seen. But even if that doesn't stay as a incentive for transparent climate disclosures, like the directors, as at least the ones who I've dealt with and gotten to talk to, really are behind this. Because again, climate risk is a financial risk. This is not something that they're just doing because it is out of the goodness of their hearts. This is about pursuing commercial opportunities and protecting yourself from financial risk.
Matt, we have reached time, so just really want to thank everyone that took the time to join us this morning. And again, apologies, Azura was not able to make it. There are a whole lot of questions that we will follow up after the session as well. So just have a fantastic day, and please do reach out.
Thank you. Ka kite.
Ka kite.